If islands are supposed to be places to disappear, these three did the exact opposite. They found the people who thought they could vanish, and they made them feel watched. I promise you true stories. First-hand accounts of nights where the sea was not a comfort but a conduit, where footprints in gravel and the memory of a voice were the only evidence anyone would ever see. Listen close, because by the time I'm done, you'll understand why these experiences have stayed with the people who lived them, and why they haunt me too. The first story came from someone I met in a diner off Route 1. A long table where fishermen and travel nurses traded coffee for local gossip. He ordered black coffee and spoke slowly, like he was testing each word before letting it go. He told me he went to get lost for a weekend. He said he wanted silence more than anything in the world. He was 22 then, exhausted in a way the rest of us recognize, the kind of tired that clings to your bones after a year of too many shifts, emails that never close, and a tiny apartment that never felt like yours. He booked a little cottage on a private, sparsely populated main island, one of those places that looks comforting in photographs. A clapboard house with peeling paint, a short wooden dock, and an inlet that turned silver at dusk. The listing promised quiet, salt air, solitude. He wanted to row the curtains, put his phone on airplane mode, and sleep without the buzzing of other people's problems. Booking it, he told me, was oddly simple. A woman who answered the rental line had a voice like cold tea, cordial but distant. She hung up before he could ask much about the island. He remembered the travel notes. A morning ferry that took under an hour on calm days, the dock with a single ramp, a gravel lane with cottages spread out like islands of light against the dark green trees. He packed light, a journal, a paperback, extra socks, his charger. He told himself it would be good to read and not think. The ferry ride let him watch the mainland recede until the horizon became a band of grey and gulls. The island's silhouette, cliffs, a few chimneys, a stand of spruce, didn't promise mystery, only distance. He clambered ashore, hauled his bag up the short ramp, and walked the gravel lane to the cottage. The house sat a few yards behind low dunes, a thin ribbon of beach separating it from the water. In daylight, the place seemed ordinary, wind-worn, generous with sunlight, the kind of ruin that felt honest because it announced its decay. Inside, it smelled like old wood and lemon oil. The curtains were thin and semi-translucent, and a strand of silver fishing line ran along the porch, probably meant to hang drying nets or nets of small things. His phone charged on the kitchen counter for the first hour. Then the battery icon gave a small, annoying ding that he ignored. He made tea, walked the shoreline, felt the scrape of cold water against his boots. Dusk came quickly. He locked the door because he had unlocked everything else as a concession to the habit of being safe. Those first hours were what he booked the place for. Gentle rhythms, the comfort of being untethered. He read until the edges of the ink blurred, and then, like most of us do, he fell asleep on the couch with a lamp left on, a book open to a paragraph he couldn't remember finishing. At some point in the middle of the night, something woke him. Not awake, the kind of alert that pulls you upright, but a thin, slicing awareness, like a single hair standing straight on your arm. He says he could tell immediately it was a sound outside, a careful, methodical step on gravel, not a deer, not the ocean. Footsteps. Someone walking the path that circled behind the cottages, the sound drawn like a thread and tugged against the clapboard. The porch light threw a pool of orange across the small yard, and the curtain made a faint moving silhouette with each step. He told me he froze, the way your body does when a memory sits up from sleep and watches you. He listened to the pattern. Step, pause. Step, pause. A half-dozen steps, then a longer pause where the person seemed to hold their breath. He slid off the couch. He peeked through the curtain and saw a dim flashlight sweep the yard, a pale round eye that never quite turned toward the cottage but circled the property in careful arcs. He remembers the smell, faint as it was, oil and salt, and the metallic hint of a motor. He tried the handle. It was locked. He couldn't tell if his fingers trembled more because of adrenaline or because of cold. He told himself, "I can get through the night." He found his phone, the battery a sliver of life, called the number on the rental confirmation. No answer. He put the phone down and watched the flashlight's arc slam into the door, as if whoever had it wanted to know if anyone was home. He said the knocking began the way a storm does. First a rapping that could be the wind, then a pattern that sounded like someone turning a key in a lock, then deliberate slams on the door that popped the jump scare out of him, each thud a small animal fleeing in his ribcage. He remembers a voice then, a voice so close it could have been right on the other side of the thin door. It was not shouting. It was a low, intimate tone that knew how to use his ears. "I know you're in there, Leo," the voice said. He remembered his own name, a private, comfortable sound that made it worse. He had never told anyone on the island his name. He had never written it on any visible tag. He pressed his back to the cold appliance of the fridge, the world reduced to the hollow between the heartbeat and the skin. The person outside didn't pound or shout anymore. They circled, they fetched their flashlight. They rested it against the clapboard and listened. When a small beam found the thin curtain, he could see a shape moving, hands visible in the small bright rectangle, as if the person were making notes or checking for signs of life. The footsteps retreated, then returned. At some point, a soft metallic clink carried in, the sound of a small boat motor being freed, the shuffle of someone nesting into a seat. He heard the engine. It started. It receded and then grew distant, like the dragging away of a tide. The last sound before any sleep at all was the motor cut. The sea takes it and smears it into nothing. He did not sleep after that. He sat with the lamp on, staring at the back door, imagining shadowed figures slipping through the dark. At 3 a.m, he packed with hands that couldn't stop shaking, put on the one heavy coat he had, and left. He unlocked the back gate and moved like a ghost to the dock. The sky had not yet brightened. Down at the water, he saw a single boat moored to the main island's public dock across the inlet, an outboard, small, parked as if whoever had come had left and then returned. There were prints in the gravel by the dock, boot treads, measured, leaving the furniture of their presence like punctuation. The prints matched each other in width and stride, but they stopped at the water's edge and never resumed. There was no sign of the person, only the tracks and the rhythm they had made. He took the first ferry back to the mainland. He walked off in a daze and told himself he would tell someone. He told himself a lot of things. He emailed the rental agency. He called the number again. He posted about it on a local message board with anonymized details so others might warn renters. He told a co-worker at the restaurant, someone who lived in the area, because the co-worker had recommended the place in the first place. "Go, get away," he had said. The co-worker, who had a laugh like a rowboat sound, shrugged when asked and said he knew the owner only slightly, that people came and went. When he pressed, the co-worker looked suddenly thin, like someone had folded him up and put him away. "Maybe someone else uses that dock," he said. "Island folks sometimes keep small crafts there. It's not safe to assume privacy out there." It was a useful shrug of responsibility. That's the part that never let go of him. The image of a person circling the cottage and speaking his name almost casually. The way the intruder treated the cottage as if it were one of many places to check. He slept for 2 nights back in the city, in his own bed, and each time a car passed on the street the curtains cast a moving shadow that his heart read as footsteps. He stopped leaving his phone charger on because the dull worry that someone might be waiting for his battery to die felt ridiculous and real at once. He changed his route to work. He asked the landlord to change the locks. He found himself checking under the car for prints. He tried to rationalize. Could someone on the island have known his name from the rental record? He had paid through a third-party service that redacted personal contact in a message. Could the co-worker have joked about him, and then something else had happened? He wrote to the ferry company to ask about boat logs, whether they kept them, and the company replied that they did not track individual small craft snooping along private docks. He wrote to the rental agency and received a terse reply: "No employees have access to renter names outside our booking software." The emails went on, polite and circular, and they did not answer the one question that mattered most to him. Did anyone on that island know his name before they circled his cottage? Months later, he returned to work, and the ocean lingered at the edge of every thought like a stain. He told himself time would wash it out. It did not. He kept thinking about the detail that felt most wrong. The voice used his name not as a threat, but as recognition. Humans do not usually say someone's name unless they expect an answer. Was it a test, a taunt, an attempt to see if he moved? Or was it simply someone who wandered islands and learned names like a fisherman learns tides? 2 weeks after he returned, he noticed a small white envelope slid under his apartment door. It contained nothing but a single line written on a torn piece of paper. "You left your charger." No symbol, no signature. He kept it in a shoebox for months, folded into the leather like an accusation. He told me he slept with a small library of such minor betrayals in his bedroom. The envelope, the memory of the flashlight beam, the gravel impressions on the ground at the dock. He told himself this was the price of wanting to be invisible. Once you step off somewhere quiet, someone else has to know you existed. How do you go back to ordinary life after a person speaks your name in the dark? He didn't fully. He learned to avoid isolated rentals and to choose hotels with the light on in the hallways. He deleted the listing from his bookmarks. He crossed out the ferry times from his memory, the way some people cross out ex-lovers from social media. Mostly he learned hypervigilance, an awareness of the in-between spaces where you might be watched. The path behind a house, the line of darkness under a car, the way a porch light might catch a flashlight without ever revealing the face behind it. I told him then what I told almost everyone I meet with a story like his. If this is talking to you, if it makes your skin go cold, leave a message below. But there's also something to be said for not dramatizing the damage. He had not been physically hurt. He had evidence, prints, a boat at the dock, a voice that used his name. There was enough to make a person believe without having to invent terror. And because people need outlets, I asked him if he'd done anything foolish afterward. Gone back to the island, tried to find the boat owner, posted photos online. He shook his head. "Curiosity almost got me once," he said. "But that fear is different now. It's not just about what someone did that night. It's the knowledge that somewhere, out past the human borders of my life, there's someone else who can map me." If you like these kinds of true island stories, hit subscribe, leave a comment below if you've ever felt the strange, cold recognition of a voice that shouldn't know your name. The boat engine becomes a motif that threads all three stories: footsteps in gravel, the thin curtain, the abandoned things that still smell faintly of living. They repeat. The second tale I was brought to by a different set of credentials altogether. An email from a structural engineering researcher named Lena, forwarded by a professor I knew who'd worked with her on coastal restoration projects. Her subject line was blunt: "You should hear what I found on Hashima." The message contained a mixtape of things: panicked email chains, photos of stairwells eaten by rust, grainy shots of narrow hallways, and a request that read, "Will you listen?" I did. Hashima is known on postcards as Battleship Island. For most of its recorded history, it was a coal island, a place of intense industrial life from the late 1800s to the 1970s, densely packed with apartment blocks and the sound of human habitation stacked like a city on the water. It became famous for its eerie, vertical ruins after the mines closed and residents left almost overnight. Today, parts of it are closed to the public. Limited visits are allowed under tight regulations. That context, publicly known facts, coal-driven boom, rapid abandonment, restricted tourist access, is important because it frames what Lena and her team were permitted to examine and where they were not. She was a structural engineer then, 29, the kind of careful person who thinks about the way a stair will hold a body and how beams refuse quietly over time. Her research permit was formal, issued through a university collaboration, signed, stamped, documented. Dr. Yamamoto had arranged it. His emails read like legalese warmed by a scholar's curiosity, methods, sampling plans, safety protocols. Lena told me she went because she wanted to understand how these massive decaying structures weathered salt and wind. She wanted to map micro-failures, to know where rot starts, and how to design a repair that would not kill the island's fragile memory. She went with a guide named Tishi, who arranged small groups and knew the permitted corridors. On arrival, the island felt exactly as a ruin should. Expansive silence broken into small, local noises. Rust flakes whispered like snow. The wind made the empty rooms sing at odd frequencies. Dust collected in thin streams like footprints made in powder, a record of what crossed the floor last. Lena took notes like a person anchoring herself to the rationale. Measurements, beam depths, the angle of a fallen wall. It was, she said, textbook work until it wasn't. Somewhere between the second and third floor apartments, she noticed things that didn't match the theory of complete abandonment. A thin path of dust across a corridor suggested repeated passage, not a single crossing. In a corner room, folded slightly like an offering, she found a thermos and 2 plastic bottles with water still in them. Nearby, blankets were compressed in a way that suggested recent use, layers pressed down like a hand in wet cement. The smell was faint but present, human sweat, cigarette smoke lingering like evidence you might mistake for the building's long history until you remember people leave their scents behind. She told Tishi about the water and the blankets. Tishi smiled a smile that did not reach his eyes and said, "There are always people who find places to sleep." He used his radio less than she expected, fingers moving with a practiced lack of attention to a device that was supposed to be for emergencies. On the surface, he was attentive, but something in the way he turned his head when she asked questions made her feel like she had pressed a palm against something fragile. He suggested they move on quickly, said the team needed to finish the East Wing before the tide changed the ferry schedule, and as they walked, he kept talking about the structural history in a tone like a teacher trying to distract a student. Lena's training shaped her curiosity into a list of plausible explanations: hidden squatters living on out of the grid, recent fishers using empty apartments for shelter, perhaps a tour group that wasn't supposed to be there. Yet what settled on her like a weight was the spatial logic that didn't add up. The water bottles were neatly arranged in a low corner, the blankets tucked as if someone had meant to return, and the dust path traced a route from the inner rooms to the stairwell, then down to a blocked corridor where rubble sat like a deliberate barrier. They rounded a stairwell that opened into a corridor and found a stack of bricks and concrete blocking the way as if built by hand. Lena could see, under the rubble, fresh marks, the scrape of something dragged, a clear sign that someone had maneuvered through. She remembered the sound that followed that discovery, footsteps above them, not on the staircase but on the floor above, moving with an urgency that was maddening to a person trained to locate stress. The steps sounded near and then receded, and when they returned only a whisper remained like breath against a wall. She took photos. She stepped lightly away as a ripple of movement seemed to track them. Someone had been around recently and often enough to leave patterns in dust and water, not meant to be there anymore. Tishi's radio kept asleep in his hand, an unused reassurance. When she asked why he had failed to alert authorities, he said, "We have the permits. This is archaeological work. We keep certain things quiet to avoid attracting tourists." The answer was practical on its face, but thin like paper behind her teeth. She couldn't pin his words to a motive, just a feeling that the island had small private economies she didn't have access to. Then the chase, what she called that part later, began in a way that scientists often recount, with a dryness that sharply contradicts the fear they felt. They were taking measurements in a long hallway when Lena heard footsteps that were not theirs. At first, she thought it was her own team, the shifting of equipment, the rattle of a chest. Then the pattern changed, the pace discordant, as if people were moving in a way designed to confuse. One set of steps would stop, then two different steps would start further down the corridor, like echoes bouncing unpredictably. She remembers the stairwell blocked behind them and the indistinct clatter of a radio left to its own static. She said they ran, stupid, instinctual, a scientist's boots clattering on stairs she'd catalogued moments before, and each time she looked back there were shadows turning corners where no one should have been, corners blocked by engineered rubble that seemed too deliberate to be natural collapse. When they reached the dock, the guide was waiting, hands folded, as if nothing had happened. There were people milling about, some workers gathering supplies, a couple of tourists with mandated hard hats. Tishi offered a terse nod and said nothing about the water bottles or the blankets. Lena asked about Dr. Yamamoto. His name was on the project emails and his face in the permission forms. Tishi's mouth tightened, then he looked away and said, "He stayed longer to inspect the boiler room. He will return." His eyes said something else. He didn't trust the notion that Yamamoto would simply walk away when his name was mentioned in the open. Lena left the island with a feeling that something had eyes deeper in the walls than they had any right to, and she found herself returning to the photos obsessively. She sent messages to Yamamoto, to the university's admin, to colleagues. She received a short, formal reply from the university. Yamamoto's itinerary had included an unscheduled personal extension they were checking, and no one at the university had evidence he had disappeared. Tishi's messages were short or delayed. Someone else asked her not to post the photos publicly due to legal restrictions. She complied because she had come as a scientist and the rules had been part of her permission. But like the first man's envelope, something small would creep back into her life to remind her of that place. A dream where stairwells swallowed her boots. A moment on a subway when she thought she heard a metallic scrape like rust flakes falling. She told me, in the calm way engineers have when they compartmentalize panic into data, that the real terror was less about the objects left behind and more about the suggestion that a human presence could exist inside layers of official neglect. If an island labeled as abandoned still had people living in its bones, who were they? Were they residents who refused to leave? Homeless families? Organized people who slipped past permits? Or something else the island held, human and hostile in a way that didn't fit into paperwork? I pressed her on Tishi. She wouldn't accuse him. "People survive in ways you don't like to imagine," she said. "He might have been protecting those people. He might have been protecting us. Or he might have been indifferent. I don't know." She sent me a photograph of a stairwell with a wet patch in the center of the corridor where someone had dragged a heavy bag. The image could be explained away by a dozen plausible stories. That ambiguity was the point. That ambiguity made the hair at the back of her neck stand up, even when she analyzed the light curve across a beam with professional detachment. Before she disappeared into conferences and field reports, she wrote a short line at the end of one email that stood out because it slid from professional to private in one breath. "We were in a place where the human residue didn't match the maps. I haven't stopped thinking about who moves like a ghost through an abandoned city." There is a short, careful public history worth mentioning. Hashima, often called Gunkanjima or Battleship Island, grew crowded in the late 19th and 20th centuries because of the coal industry, and then emptied when mines shuttered. In recent decades, it's become an icon of industrial decay and a subject of limited, regulated access to preserve safety and memory. That background doesn't explain the water bottles, the blankets, or the people Lena heard on the stairs. It only frames why any signs of recent habitation felt like a violation of expectations. After our conversation, she sent one more email. It was short and contained one question and a line I could not shake. If someone is hiding in a place that everyone calls dead, are they hiding from the world or from someone else who wants it quiet? She didn't answer that question herself, and neither would I. I had planned to write up Lena's account and let it sit as a cautionary curiosity about the way built environments keep secrets. But the detail of a voice calling a name at a main cottage and the detail of blankets on Hashima's floor began to feel like beads on the same string. The same motif threaded them: isolated places, the assumption of emptiness, the sudden intimate awareness of another human who shouldn't be there. Those echoes made me start asking around for more stories. The third account I was given in a message thread from a friend who teaches modern history. He forwarded me a recording, no, not a recording of voices, just a message that said, "You want this?" and a one-paragraph plea. "My students want to go see North Brother Island for a night. He warned me they'd be breaking rules. I have a rule about trespass. Don't condone it, don't provide routes, don't glamorize it. But I am also a person who listens to what people tell me, so I asked for names." He replied with 3, Jansen, Jesse, and Haley. They were college students, thesis hunters, the kind who chase ghosts in paperwork and maps to fix the past into pages. They wanted to kayak under a moonlight and set foot on the island that once housed a notorious hospital. They wanted to see for their research, and maybe, he wrote in a smaller font in that message, for the thrill. North Brother Island sits cradled in the East River, not as far-flung as the main place or as mythic as Hashima, but isolated in its own right. Its coastline choked with vines, its piers eaten away, its history laced with disease wards and quarantined lives. It's public knowledge that North Brother was home to quarantine hospitals and the infamous Riverside Hospital. Access has been tightly controlled for decades because of safety and to preserve remains of fragile structures. That history is relevant. Spaces once used for containment are layered with associations more complicated than empty buildings. Haley, who wrote me the night after their trip, had the tone of someone who had narrowly escaped disaster and found herself more alive for it. She described the night in long, sinewy sentences that pulled at attention. They left the city in cheap kayaks, 3 people testing tides and each other. The river at night was a glass of black mercury. They pulled up at a bank, where the undergrowth took their boats like offerings, and climbed out into hollow birdsong and the smell of river rot. The island welcomed them with an atmosphere that made them small. The wind moved slow through broken windows, as if it were trying not to disturb anything. They split up because they are young, and because that is how you think you can squeeze the most out of a forbidden place. 2 ahead, 1 trailing, eyes hunting for plaques or doors. Haley says she heard Jesse's voice call from ahead, a casual, bright call, like friendship condensed into a single sound. She followed it into a pitch-dark room and found, at the far wall, an impossibly tall figure with its back to them, hunched, shoulders higher than any human she knew. The figure faced the wall and made a small, rhythmic motion. Haley called Jesse's name back and then realized Jesse was not there. She could hear Jesse somewhere outside, calling back to them where the collapsing porch jutted into the river. She turned and ran, because once you find a giant where a human should be, your options shrink to panic and escape. Jansen and Jesse both reported the same thing, that when they gathered at the boat, they heard a voice call Jesse's name from inside the ruins, a voice so like Jesse's that for a small, impossible instant, Jesse himself stepped toward the echo to answer it. He stopped when his hand brushed the other air, and they all left without waiting to confirm the impossibility. Haley later wrote me that the worst part wasn't the tall figure they had glimpsed and couldn't identify. It was the voice, because a human voice in the wrong place upends your sense of who is where. It's one thing to see something unexpected. It's another to be spoken to by a familiar sound where you know the speaker cannot be. They left the island that night and returned to campus, and curiosity turned the event into theories. Pranksters who mimicked voices, someone with a radio or a speaker inside an empty room, the wind playing tricks on cognition, but tests didn't align cleanly. Jesse took a short audio clip on his phone. Nothing of interest, just water lapping and distant traffic. He tried to recreate the call. His voice, released in the same way, echoed differently. None of them could explain how a voice that sounded exactly like Jesse had called from inside when Jesse stood on the dock and could not possibly have been in two places at once. There is a legal and ethical side to these stories I want to underline now. Access to places like North Brother Island and Hashima is restricted for public safety and preservation. Trespassing can be dangerous and illegal. These accounts involve people taking risks, and I do not endorse breaking rules or making dangerous choices to seek something eerie. More than once, someone I interviewed told me their fear of being judged for curiosity. Curiosity killed the cliché. Here, curiosity brought home a lesson. Some things are best approached with permission, with daylight, or not at all. But the motif persists. A voice, a presence, a place thought empty that isn't. In the main cottage, the intruder called a private name and left prints and a boat engine echoing in the night. On Hashima, blankets and water suggested living people inside a structure the world labeled as dead. On North Brother Island, an undeniably familiar voice echoed from a place a friend insisted he resided nowhere near. What ties these scenes together isn't a single answer. It's the way small, ordinary things, names, bottles, footsteps, become proof that isolation is porous. I started to ask questions that had nothing to do with police reports or evidence. What does it feel like to sleep with the idea that someone could know you just enough to say your name? What does it do to your day-to-day to have a person-shaped hole in your family of certainties? People in these stories stopped sleeping well. They would wake and see flashlights in curtains where none were. Some began to notice patterns in other small things. Lightly rearranged furniture, a stranger always at the edges of town who knew their routine. Others simply stopped going somewhere in case their absence could be mapped. When I asked each of them, gently because there is a rawness to retelling, what they would want anyone to know, they offered the same thin, weary line. The evidence is not always spectacular. It's the quiet that makes the loudest claim. Footprints in a gravel yard, a single motorboat at dawn, a blanket folded away in a concrete apartment, a voice that calls your name from somewhere that by all rights should not know you. Those are the things that haunt because they persist as proof of presence, without explanation. At the moment I'm writing this, the first two stories remain unresolved in my mind. The main caller's envelope was never matched to an owner. The records the ferry company gave him were sparse. The university could not confirm or deny Dr. Yamamoto's movements beyond formal emails. Tishi's silence sits like a stone inside a shoe. My own list of questions is long, and I mean to follow some of them up. I've made a few cautious calls, but the kind of answers that might comfort aren't always available, and sometimes the silence is the most honest reply we get. There is a small, specific sound I keep returning to, an outboard motor cutting away at the lip of dawn. It is a sound that suggests a small craft cradling something called a way into the fog. It is the sound that connects one set of footprints to the absence that follows. It is a sound that becomes, in recollection, a punctuation mark in narrative memory, an ending that doesn't explain itself. I told myself at first that I would gather all three stories, analyze them, and offer a tidy conclusion. A thesis about human presence in abandoned spaces, about the psychology of being watched. But as these stories collected, they refused tidy endings. They insist on being messy, like the dust in Lena's stairwell or the envelope under a door. They ask questions of the listener that are not mine to answer. Who gets to claim a deserted place? Who counts as an inhabitant? When does a place change from being abandoned to being occupied in ways that official maps won't show? The next story, Lena's account from Hashima, pulls harder than the rest. Her field notes carried a tone of precise anxiety, and the more I read, the more the island felt less like a ruin and more like a place with a secret economy. People moving through, using space, and choosing silence over the exposure of permits and records. I booked a ticket on a long flight because her emails suggested one more thing. There were photographs she couldn't send over email, images she wanted to show me, eyes wanting the testimony of someone who would listen without interpreting too quickly. I arrived in Japan with a bag that still smelled faintly of coffee, thinking I would be a sympathetic ear and maybe a story collector. Dr. Yamamoto was, in person, guardedly polite. He had the manner of someone who has taught students to look closely and then to look away. When I asked about his extension on Hashima, he let his fingers fold a napkin and said, "Hashima is complicated. There are people who live in the margins. There are practical decisions we sometimes must not make public for safety." His language was careful, as if words on paper might tilt a balance. Tishi watched the conversation from the doorway with an inscrutable half-smile. We scheduled a visit with Lena to see the images she had kept private. The photos were not cinematic, they were clinical and compulsive, the kind of documentation you make when you can't trust your memory. Staircases, angles of collapse, the darker shot of a corridor where a patch of floor looked tamped down, as if someone had spent a life resting in that spot. The last image was the one that unsettled me most. A corner with a blanket, folded just so, 2 bottles half hidden near a wall, a small indentation on the cushion of a collapsed chair, as if someone had only walked a few steps away. After looking at the photos, we drove to the ferry point together. The harbour smelled of diesel and tuna, the air thick with a humidity that made the metal on the dock feel warm under my palms. The ferry to Hashima was scheduled, and we joined a sparse group. This was not to be a tourist jaunt. Our access was authorized, but the permit was strict. Stick with the escort, stay in the permitted areas, do not cross barriers. You can feel an island's history on your skin before you can see it. Hashima's was the smell of old coal, rendered into rust and salt, and the wind carried the particular silence of places meant for many people. As we pulled away from Nagasaki, the shoreline dissolved into a series of vertical shadows. Looking back at the city felt like leaving language behind. The ferry's motion made the world small and loud. Hands tightened around camera straps, boots found purchase on a slippery deck. Tishi seemed smaller on the ferry than in photos, less guarded and a little too sure of the route. We disembarked, and the island's scale was immediate. Stacked apartment blocks, a narrow jungle of staircases, iron frameworks like the skeleton of something once alive. We stayed in the permitted corridor at first, and Lena pointed out micro-failures she'd catalogued, a floor ridge here, a corroded bolt there. Then she led us further, to the place where she had found the blanket and bottles. The corridor there smelled damp and human. Tishi hesitated at the corner and tapped a long, quick note into his radio. I should have paid more attention to that pause. He looked at us, smiled, and said, "There are people in places we don't expect." The phrase could have been a simple reflection on urban decay, but his tone was not reflective. It was small and wry, gesturing toward a set of choices no one in our group seemed to be able to make. He started speaking about official preservation and the need to limit exposure, and then quieted when a subtle movement suggested someone else listened in. We turned a corner and found a stairwell blocked by rubble in a way that suggested it was not mere collapse but a deliberate barrier. Lena took measurements anyway. The rubble blocked any easy passage. Above, we heard steps. Not the measured steps of our group, but something hurried and close. Then the steps stopped, as if someone had pulled their foot off a pedal and sucked the sound back into the building. The corridor held its breath, and for a moment all we could hear was the faint hiss of the tide far below and the rust flakes settling like a slow rain. Then a single sharp impact, something heavy thrown against the far wall, the kind of noise that says a person wasn't merely passing but intended to bar a route or to warn anyone behind it that they were cutting the map. We ran. It wasn't noble or planned. It was an animal response. Boots, the slap of our packs, the quick intake of breath that turns into an unspoken coordination. Lena shouted for the stairwell we thought we'd come up and found it packed with concrete and rebar, arranged like someone had chosen to make the island into a maze, with doors barricaded from within. The rubble had edges that still crumbled when you touched them. The grey powder on our hands felt like a record of a recent passage. Above us, footsteps ran like a second heartbeat. They ascended and descended at odd intervals, as if more than one person moved on different schedules. The stairwell we'd planned to use became an impossible choice. We tried a service corridor and found an oil-slicked floor that betrayed every footprint, then a doorway that led to a room warmed in a way that made the hairs on my forearms stand up. The concrete itself seemed to wear warmth in one narrow patch, like a palm had been held there recently. I remember thinking, with an engineer's disgust for uncertainty, that the human body leaves more than noise, heat, smell, compressed dust. There was all of that here, and it sat at the edge of what we were permitted to see, and the things that someone had decided to keep invisible. Tishi clutched his radio, but did not call in a full alert. Instead, he murmured into it in a tone meant to be casual, something about the tide and a schedule. His casualness felt deliberate, like someone choosing their words to fold around a truth they didn't want to pry open. We found our way out by clinging to memory, stepping where Lena had identified adequate load-bearing flooring. The island swallowed the sound of our boots the way it swallowed echoes, deadening them against corrugated walls. When we broke into the open air at the dock, Tishi stood in a posture of bored expectation, as if he had been waiting to see how two nervous scientists might perform their exit strategy. "Dr. Yamamoto?" Lena asked, breathless. She had been the one to mention him when we were still on the ferry, the name tethered to the official veneer of the trip. Tishi looked at her, and for the first time his face betrayed an edge of annoyance that wasn't professional discretion, but personal impatience. "He stayed longer," he said. "There were places he wanted to check." His answer landed like a closed door. "He will return with the ferries," he added, like a man repeating a script. We boarded back onto the vessel with a hollowed calm. In the harbour the water was the colour of old banknotes. The city across the harbour felt insulated, clean-edged and bureaucratic. "I sent Yamamoto a curt message that night, 'Did you stay on the island longer?' and received a line that made me lift the phone twice to make sure I wasn't misreading. An automated out-of-office reply, and then nothing. The university replied to Lena's inquiry with a polite note promising to check into itineraries and to prioritize safety reports. Days stretched, and the replies did not bring clarity. Each slow email became its own small anxiety. In the weeks after, Lena told me she stopped by the campus office to check access logs, spoke to a junior admin who said that anyone with permits had to log arrival and departure times. The records she saw were patchwork, some things stamped, other things missing pages. The deputy who handled field protocols was brief and anxious. "Sometimes paperwork is incomplete," he said. "Sometimes these places have lives that don't show up on a spreadsheet." His phrase was a translation for a phenomenon Lena had spent a lifetime trying to ignore. Places have unofficial circuits, people who move through them, sometimes in the open, sometimes in the shadow of officialdom. Tishi's messages remained sparse. When she pressed, he wrote that the island had people who are home by choice, and that some stories are for the island. The words were opaque, like a seal on a box. Lena could not decide whether he was protecting people who had no other place to land, or protecting a version of the island that benefited from being quiet. Either interpretation sat like a stone in her pocket. A month after our trip, I received an email from Yamamoto's assistant asking whether I had any professional concerns to submit through formal channels. The email was polite and administrative. If there were any safety incidents, they would be logged and investigated. That same week, an article in a small regional paper described increased surveillance and stricter enforcement for unauthorized entries on Hashima. It quoted an official who said the island's safety was paramount. The article cited the island's status as a heritage site needing managed access. The public record was neat. The parts Lena described, the blankets, the warm corner, the way footsteps seemed to thread corridors, remained anecdotal, stubbornly human and stubbornly unruly against the clean edges of policy. There is a small hazard to consider here, a safety and ethics note I want to make plain before moving on. These islands, whether mythic decayed ruins or municipal protected parcels, are often dangerous and frequently restricted for good reasons. Unstable structures, wildlife, hazardous materials, and legal protections are real. People I spoke to took risks I cannot condone, and nothing I present here should be read as encouragement to trespass. Access granted under permits, during daylight and with proper safety protocols, is the only responsible way to explore these places. Curiosity is natural, reckless exposure is not. After Hashima, I needed a few days just to clear the sediment of it from my mind. Lena's photographs and the picture of Tishi with that too-quiet smile haunted an in-between space where human kindness could be both protective and complicit. I tried to put the story into a framework, people living in ruin, caretakers who may or may not be shielding them, an academic presence that keeps the map tidy while people's lives refuse to fit into the lines. But tidy framework slipped away when I pictured the blanket in the corridor, pressed as if by a knee or a resting shoulder. A person might sleep there after midnight to avoid the lights. They might sleep there because they had nowhere else. The knowledge that someone else inhabited the island made the place less romantic ruin and more occupied home, which drew a line between the comfortable curiosity of tourists and the messy ethics of survival. The final image that stuck with Lena, and with me when she sent the short private sentence that followed our last formal exchange, was of a stairwell with a wet smear where someone had dragged a bag. That smear suggested a brief, urgent movement. It implied a person in transit, someone who needed to be somewhere else quickly, not a permanent denizen, but a life threaded through the island at odd intervals. Who moves like that in a place many people call dead? Who decides which lives to erase from the ledger? I left Japan with a sense that some places keep their own keepers, and those keepers operate according to rules outside of bureaucratic notice. My next story was in some ways smaller, the urban island in the East River, but it cut in a different way, speaking to the way voices can steal location from bodies. Where Hashima felt like a secret economy of inhabitation, North Brother Island felt like a place that used sound itself as an instrument of disorientation. There is a short, factual sketch worth including about North Brother Island. Public records show it as the site of Riverside Hospital and Quarantine Station, a small island with a history tied to public health and seclusion. After decades of closure and structural decay, authorities have tightly limited access to the island for safety and preservation reasons. That history, publicly documented, matters because the island's past as a site of isolation and containment gives any encounter there a social and emotional weight beyond the purely physical hazards. The night Haley recounted felt cinematic in the telling, but was grounded in the quiet reality of three students who underestimated how small and unforgiving a place could feel at 2 in the morning. They had drawn a perimeter plan in their minds, a set of spots to visit and a timeline to keep. Youth lends a false armor. Maps give a false sense of mastery. They beached the kayaks under the choke of vines and pushed into the island's underskirt, each footfall a negotiation with the soil and the history underfoot. Haley's description of the tall figure remains one of those images that lodges and resists any clean explanation. She says it was too large to be human without some contortion, shoulders high, silhouette too elongated. The head bowed slightly as if studying the wall. They had agreed to radios and to call out if one of them got lost. Jesse, ahead and light on his feet, shouted back, an easy, bright call to Haley that she remembered as warm. Then a voice that was Jesse's, layered like an echo, but precise and full, called his name from inside a collapsed room. She remembers the split-second recognition, a voice like belonging, and then the dissolving of that recognition into immediate, primitive alarm. Jesse himself answered from the porch. His reply floated out from his actual position and hit the hollow like a mismatch. For a few seconds everything staggered. Jesse prepared to step toward a voice that couldn't be his, then hesitated as the logic reasserted itself. We rehearse how strange that must have been, how easy to imagine a prank or a mimic. Yet the group swore that the timbre of the call, the cadence, the nick of laughter behind the name was impossible to replicate in the moment. They left. They didn't take photographic evidence beyond a few shaky shots of broken windows and rot. They didn't approach the figure again. What my historian friend relayed, and what Haley's message insisted upon, was the way the voice rewired them. Afterward, Jesse felt less solid to himself. Haley felt less safe around spoken names. Jansen found himself pausing when a roommate called him from across a dorm room, checking that the sound had come from the right place. They tried experiments. Jesse recorded his own voice in different parts of the city, played back clips near buildings, tried reproducing the timbre and the precise inflection. None matched the occurrence on the island. One of them joked, half serious, maybe concrete makes voices do tricks. Another suggested an old device, speaker or FM loop, left in a room. But practical tests failed to reproduce the intimacy of the original call. That intimacy is the part that terrified them. A voice is a shortcut to trust. When it appears where no person stands, trust fractures. The student's story carries a final bureaucratic artifact. After their visit, the Parks Department increased enforcement and posted legal notices reminding the public that the island is off-limits without authorization. Their professor, who had forwarded the initial thread to me, later told me he relayed their account to an archivist who simply said, "Islands keep their own memories." The archival response was vague but eerily apt. Islands are repositories for human absences, and sometimes absences remember in the form of sound. Years later, each of the people I spoke to described an ongoing effect that wasn't dramatic but cumulative. The main visitor kept the envelope with, "You left your charger." Lena checks images of stairwells before she sleeps and sometimes wakes with rust flaking across her palms. Jesse avoids places where he might be called from a position he isn't in. These are small shifts. Sleep architecture changed. A bodily sense of being observed. A reluctance to be alone in certain geographies. The haunting here is not a visitation in the Gothic sense, but a slow erosion of the sense that the world makes sense. People ask me why these stories mattered beyond their immediate creepiness. It's because they're not simply about scary moments. They're about the fragility of privacy in liminal places. Islands are often sold to us as escapes. They are marketed as private, self-contained, a place to be off-grid. But what all these narratives show is that islands, even the smallest of them, are porous. They admit currents of people, ideas, and intentions. The idea of going to a place to be unseen can be an illusion. The more you try to be invisible, the more you become a target for pattern mapping, for the people who walk the thresholds between public life and hidden networks. Another common thread is the use of sound as a tool. Voices, name calls, mimicry were a strategy across different islands, and there is something deeply human and therefore perilous about a name spoken in the wrong place. It is as if sound can sever the bond between location and personhood. In the cognitive map we carry, names mark presence. When a name is spoken where the named person is absent, the map tears. I followed up for months in the small, patient ways that won't make headlines. I combed rental records where possible, wrote to university administrators and the park services, and spent a few late nights searching for anything that connected these incidents. The outcomes were frustratingly bureaucratic, polite denials, assurances that records would be checked, and in several cases, the suggestion that individuals had gone to risky places and assumed the attendant hazards. No agency had a narrative that implicated a coordinated threat or a tidy explanation. That absence of institutional narrative is itself a kind of answer. Some things persist on the margins because acknowledging them requires resources, risk, and accountability that institutions aren't always willing or able to expend. I also asked about the possibility of pranksters, organized groups, or people making a living off tourists' fear. Those theories hold some weight. In other areas of the world, there are documented cases of people staging encounters or selling scare experiences. But in these accounts, the physical clues, boots in gravel, a boat at a dock, bottles tucked like offerings, a smear where a bag had been dragged, provide a stubborn materiality that a prank alone doesn't fully explain. The who and the why remain open questions. Maybe the most human answer is the simplest and the most unsettling. Islands attract people who prefer the margins, people without legal homes, people who perform maintenance in shadow economies, people who move quietly to survive. They also attract people who like to be unobserved and therefore practice observation themselves. Or perhaps there's a mixture, neighbors, trespassers, caretakers, and opportunists occupying overlapping orbits. For those who seek solitude, the presence of others, whether benevolent or predatory, signals that solitude is never purely a choice. It is negotiated by context. If there's a moral here, it is complicated. None of the people I spoke to wanted to turn their experience into a moral lesson about safety, but they did urge a practical humility, respect the borders of places, assume danger in structures left to decay, and understand that your curiosity may intersect with other people's survival strategies. When I pressed for what they would have done differently, every one of them gave the practical answer: permission, daylight, an authorized guide, and the quieter, harder admission: I would have trusted my fear when it told me something was wrong. You might leave this with a skepticism that these are isolated anecdotes stitched into a horror outline. You might form your own easy explanation. That is reasonable and healthy. But part of what stays with me is the texture of ordinary things. A flashlight beam on a curtain, a folded blanket, a boot print that stops at the waterline, a voice calling a name where no speaker stands. These are not cinematic supernatural markers. They are human details that insist on being read as evidence of other people's presence. When I let these images crowd the edges of sleep, they do not cohere into a tidy plot. Instead, they settle like a residue, an ache made of possibilities. The main cottage could have been a targeted bother, a local checking cabins, someone playing games. Hashima could harbor informal communities that official maps ignore. North Brother might harbor tricksters or acoustic oddities. All of those possibilities are plausible. None fully resolves the feeling that some kind of attention followed people into places where they believed themselves safe. And that attention changes people. It modifies behavior. It calibrates trust. It teaches a weary realism about how porous solitude really is. The main visitor now chooses places with staff overnight. Lena checks stairwells and sleeps less easily. The students avoid forbidden ruins and risk less. Those are small survivals, adaptive, sensible, but they are also defeats in a humble register. Isolation, when it becomes dangerous to want, is no longer a refuge. As I close, and the final chord must be honest rather than sensational, consider the ordinary objects again. The envelope tucked under a door, the water bottles in a corner, a flashlight sweeping a thin curtain, the sound of an outboard motor cutting its cord at dawn. Think of those things not as window dressing, but as the proof of presence. Imagine the slow corrosive of being reminded that someone else knows the outlines of your life, well enough to call your name, to leave a token, to occupy a corridor you assumed was empty. There is no showy reveal here, no final confrontation where the villain is unmasked. The ending is ordinary, the phone that doesn't ring back, the office that sends a polite form reply, the official notice that enforces restrictions. The residue left behind is less violence than a changed anatomy of belief, the quiet knowledge that the world is less private than we assume, and that an island's silence can be filled in a dozen ways, not all of them explainable. If you ask me which of these stories haunts me most, I could not pick one. They haunt in different registers, a name spoken in the dark, a human presence where maps say none, a voice that steals location from a person. Each of them lingers like a single line of a song that returns unsolicited. Each asks a stubborn question about who gets to be seen and who gets to be unseen. These are true island stories. They are not fictional leaps or manufactured scares. They are accounts from people who stepped away from a known place and found themselves attended by other kinds of attention. Careful, casual, possibly protective, possibly predatory. Whatever the motives, the result is the same, a feeling of being watched, of having a private life that becomes part of someone else's map. So if islands are supposed to be escapes, these three did the opposite. They pulled the people who sought anonymity back into networks they could not fully name. You can keep your skepticism. You can theorize very boldly about pranksters, squatters, caretakers, or acoustic tricks. But don't shrug off the detail that binds the stories together. The small, physical things that make ambiguity stubborn. The motorboat's wake, the crushed blanket, the boot print ending at water, a voice speaking a name where no mouth can be found. They will not resolve neatly in your head, not because the facts are denied, but because the human part of these stories refuses tidy closure. The tension remains, the trace remains, the unease remains. These are the kinds of island things that don't finish. They settle in like a pebble under the skin. If one of these accounts has lodged under your skin, if it stirred a memory of a strange knock, a voice out of place, a footprint you couldn't account for, leave a comment and tell that story. Subscribe for more true horror like this if you want to keep listening. And whenever you think of islands as escapes, remember the sound of a boat motor fading into fog, and the way a human name can suddenly become a call to attention you never invited. These true island horror stories will haunt you forever.